Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alphecca Muttardy, and I'm with the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank. And what we'd like to do today is to give you a little update on where we are with financing infrastructure and other things through the federal budget and what implications that have for the roads and streets in your area. First of all, I'd like to bring up a few slides, and then we're also joined by Dr. Stephen Hubbard, who is going to talk about some of the implications and consequences of not having enough funding for the projects. And we're also joined by Stan Forzik, a former executive from Amtrak, who's going to ask us some pertinent questions to better hone in on explaining where we are today. So I'm going to pull up a few slides to explain where we are. And these slides aim to give you a kind of a picture of where we are as of today, August 13th, 2021, in terms of financing our infrastructure projects through the federal budget. So there is a two-track approach going on now with the Biden administration and with some Senate Republicans to finance infrastructure. We call that the Senate bipartisan bill. And just recently, the Senate approved that bill on August 10 to provide $550 billion of new money over the next 5 years. Most of it is for transportation, although there's some other money in there for the electric grid and broadband, and a very small amount for water infrastructure, but nowhere near not enough. So that's the spending plan. Paying for the plan has been the biggest impediment or the biggest challenge for legislators to agree upon. They have finally agreed to pay for about half of the plan by repurposing unspent coronavirus relief money and by tightening some reporting gains from cryptocurrency investments. But the Congressional Budget Office reports that only half of the plan is paid for. So the rest will be through a deficit spending. The plan currently has dropped the proposal for an infrastructure financing authority, although there's still some language in the bill that pushes investments towards public-private partnerships. And Dr. Stephen Hubbard is going to talk to you a little bit about those in a minute. So as I said, the Senate has approved this bill on August 10. It now goes to the House, where it is waiting in the House for an agreement on the second phase, which is the reconciliation package. So this is the reconciliation package. It is a $3.5 trillion package that the Democrats hope to pass with a simple majority under reconciliation rules, a simple majority of only Democrats on board. And that package is composed of rolls together four things. The first is the fiscal year 2022 budget that will pay for things like military spending and other operations of the federal government, and then our mandatory spending for healthcare and Social Security. It will also roll together the baseline spending for infrastructure, which is called reauthorization bills. Every 5 years, the budget proposes a new 5-year plan for paying for transportation and water infrastructure, and we call that baseline spending, and that will be rolled together into this bill. In addition, it'll roll together the $1.8 trillion American Families Plan, which I'll go into in a little bit. And then it will also extend the debt limit because we're spending every year more than we're bringing in in tax receipts. And our raising of the debt limit had expired at the end of this July, and so we need to raise it for the next extended period. There is no money, however, in this reconciliation package for high-speed rail and some other things that came out of the earlier infrastructure plan, but which Republicans and Democrats couldn't agree to in this plan. But specifically, there's no money in there for high-speed rail. So the framework has been published by Senator Sanders' Budget Committee, which gives the whole outline for fiscal year 2022 in the next 10 years. It next goes to Senator Wyden's Finance Committee, where it could run into a few snags. The Republicans on that committee will certainly object to all of the large spending programs. And in addition, even some conservative Democrats on that committee, Senator Wyden among them, Senator Warner and some others, may object to how we finance this and the whatever deficit it will produce. So those are the two packages. They're on track. They're moving. They're related to each other. One can't pass without the other. But even if both of them do pass, we'll still be $4.5 trillion short, which I'll point out to you just how that looks. So we are proposing, of course, a national infrastructure bank to top up all the spending, $5 trillion, for all these different categories. And we think that we need this bill in addition to whatever packages the Senate and the House managed to come up with. And here's essentially the reason why we need a $5 trillion bank. The American Society of Civil Engineers say that we have a funding gap. That is, after we account for whatever baseline spending for infrastructure happens through the federal budget and whatever state and local budgets come up with out of their budgets, we still have this funding gap of $2.6 trillion over the next 10 years, which is not being addressed by this bipartisan plan. And in addition, we have added categories of our own that we think are really important hard infrastructure categories for affordable housing, high-speed rail, and large water projects, and of course, this broadband issue down here. So we will need at least $5 trillion. And if the current plans come up with only $550 billion over 5 years, that will certainly not be enough to cover everything. And that will have huge implications because if we don't spend enough on infrastructure, then as Stephen is going to point out to you, our infrastructure crumbles even faster, and then we need more money later on to fix it. So I wanted to say just a little bit really quickly about this $3.5 trillion budget resolution, because it gives you a picture of what the whole plan looks like for the next 10 years out. Whenever you come up with a new fiscal year budget, you have to also forecast all your revenues and all your spending for the next 10 years out, so that when the budget is being considered, legislators can consider what direction we're going in and whether we have enough money, and what's happening also importantly to our overall debt limit. So I looked at the Sanders budget resolution for fiscal year 2022, and that has the forecast all the way out for the next 10 years. And then I did a simple calculation on what was how did spending in the final year 2031 compare and grow from the first year 2022. And this is what these spending categories show. First of all, military spending is forecast to go up by another 15%. Even though we're withdrawing out of Afghanistan, we're still putting money into military spending. The climate change pieces of infrastructure that were taken out of the earlier bill and put into this bill were put in under the environmental category. They are expected to go up by 13%. That'll include things like charging stations and things like that. Transportation, surprisingly, this baseline transportation spending over the next 10 years is forecast to go down by 4%. Education will go up by 53%. That includes new pre-K facilities and home care facilities, and also providing tuition-free education for a 2-year college degree. Health spending will go up. Medicaid will go way up by 95%. Because Medicaid programs will be rolled into states that don't have them at the current point in time. And then as an economist, I could tell you the number that I always watch and look for carefully is the interest on our national debt. We don't ever really pay back our national debt every year, but we must pay the interest on the debt. And the interest is a function of how much debt do we have, and then where are interest rates going into the future. This budget forecasts that interest on the debt will go up by 174%. That'll be sucking up a lot of our revenues into the future that cannot then be going into infrastructure and new transportation spending. And also the stock of the debt whether it is from whether it's from the family plan as part of this, or it's from the infrastructure bills as part of this, anyway, or if it's from the the Medicare and Medicaid programs, whatever's causing it, the stock of debt over the next 10 years is expected to rise by another 50%, from 30 trillion up to 45 trillion. And that will be sucking away a lot of our resources on paying for the debt. Meanwhile, we can have a national infrastructure bank that provides $5 trillion today for the next 10 years to meet all of our infrastructure needs and makes no calls on the federal budget for new taxes, deficit spending, or anything like that. And we can fix all of our infrastructure today.
So good afternoon. My name is Dr. Stephen Hubbard. I'm going to talk about public-private partnerships and deferred maintenance. And let me get my slides up here. There we go. So one of the features of the current compromise legislation is that if there's a project, it first has to be offered to out as a public-private partnership. And the problem with PPPs is that basically the private parties need at least a 10 to 15% return on their investment. Otherwise, there's no reason to do it in the United States. They can get that offshore in many, many different countries. And the problem then also is that if the partnership goes south and there's a problem with how the project, whatever it is, the infrastructure is being built, basically the government then picks up the tab. And so in a lot of cases, even though it looks they look attractive at the start, many large PPPs have ended in failure with massive lawsuits, and then basically whatever the government agency is picking up the tab. And as an example of why they just don't work well, there's the Transportation Innovation Act, which basically provides money for transportation PPPs, and it has $70 billion sitting unused of federal funds, and there have been no rural programs, indicating that there's just not a lot of infrastructure out there, at least in terms of transportation, that PPPs will work in. And one of the reasons that, of course, there was a Brookings Institute study that found that 61% of the roads in the United States either break even or lose money. And so there's just no way you're going to squeeze 15% of profit out of the road segment that's losing money. And also the other thing is that if you take a bridge or a tunnel that maybe you could make some money off of because it's a high traffic area, and you turn that into a PPP, and now there's a private agency that's making 15% profit on it, that was profit that you could have set up yourself with your own organization and be using that then to subsidize portions of the transportation infrastructure or whatever part of your infrastructure is that doesn't make money. But now, because you've turned that into a PPP, you're going to have to raise rates and make up for that loss. As an example of how they just don't work, the EPA has two circular systems that provide money that then can be paid back, a state revolving fund. And even with those, providing money, they're only 1.7% of the country's 52,000 municipal water systems have been privatized. And Food and Water Watch, when they've looked at what happens when you privatize water or sewer utilities and water, the average increase in cost is 33%, for sewer at 60%. And Texas Power, of course, which recently was in the news with the massive blackouts for 2 weeks and the loss of power and water for 4.5 million families, resulting in 200 to 700 deaths. They pay 60% more for their power over the last decade or so. So it's a terrible deal overall, except in a few circumstances where there's an easy in and an easy out for the privatization and the agency that, excuse me, the enterprise that's providing the funds. So in terms of roads, what's wrong with roads is that, so I'm not going to jump to deferred maintenance. So this is a road condition from 100% here down to 5% here, which, as you can see, is falling apart, has that characteristic alligator look. And so what this is pavement condition, and this is time. And what happens is if you keep up with the maintenance on roads, then a road can last for 20 to 30 years. But if you withhold maintenance, the drop off is precipitous. And in just 2 to 3 years, the cost of repairing the road can go back up by a factor of 4 to a factor of 10 or more. And so this is the problem with the current spending plan is it doesn't provide enough to cover the deferred maintenance. And just so you don't think that this is just in theory with a pretty picture, in 2008, over 530 of California's transportation agencies responsible for about 85% of the road network decided to pool their data because they were concerned about the state's road conditions. And it's an organization called Save California Streets. You can go find it on the web, savecaliforniastreets.org. And basically they discovered after 4 years that the backlog, the amount of money it was going to take to put the state's roads and bridges into good repair wasn't 10 to $15 billion, which everyone was kind of assuming. It was actually $40 billion. And the cost was going to balloon to $66 billion in just 10 years. This is the exponential growth of deferred maintenance if you don't take care of things all the time. And as a result, they were finally able, after 20 years, to get an increase in their motor fuel taxes, facing this literally avalanche of debt. So in terms of the compromise bill, so here this yellow area basically represents the unfunded deficit of the United States in terms of transportation. This is, infrastructure. And again, this is just to fix what's broken. This is not improving any, adding things in to keep up with foreign competition. And so that's the yellow area, somewhere between $4 and $7.5 trillion. And up here, you see what PPPs will cover, the 1 to 2%. So you can see it's very small. Over here, we have essentially the compromise bill with $550 billion a year. Actually, you need to spend at least $125 billion to $200 billion a year to keep up with the deferred maintenance. Otherwise, things are getting worse. And so it's a little bit like someone showing up to a sinking boat and say, hey, I have a bilge pump that'll run at 110 gallons per minute. And you say, great, we're taking on 125 to 200 gallons a minute. That's not going to help at all. We're still going to sink. And this is the problem. And this is why the $5 trillion infrastructure bank is needed. The two purple areas down here show what happens if the compromise bill is duplicated and it's essentially the same amount is extended over 10 years. You can see this little bit of coverage here, again, versus the total deficit. And again, this is just to fix what is broken, not keeping up with the competition like high-speed rail, 6G, 1 to 2 trillion for flying cars, high-speed freight, or cybersecurity to protect ourselves from Russia and China and North Korea, somewhere between $200 billion and $1 trillion. And none of that is anywhere in the current funding. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stan Forzik. I'm a member of the advisory board of the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank, and I am a retired executive from Amtrak, working in both finance and infrastructure, and also worked for a consulting firm dealing in the energy sector. I'm here to pose certain questions to both Alphecca, who did an excellent job explaining the bank and other things, and Dr. Hubbard, who did a really great job explaining deferred maintenance and some of the other things that are on his slides. So I'd like to pose these questions. I'm going to start with Alphecca. And Alphecca, you did an excellent job explaining where things are between the two bills and what's going on as we move forward. Again, these bills are just plans for infrastructure. And we've been watching this for almost a month now, that the news media is actually saying things that would lead the general public and a lot of political people at certain levels in one direction. And it's not really going in direction. It's really a parallel type of arrangement. Could you take a moment or two and just explain what's going to happen as we move forward? These are just plans, but eventually we want to get to the point of actually funding something or financing something. Could you outline what is going to be the steps and what is the coalition's expectation as we move forward?
Thank you very much for your question, Stan. So the bipartisan infrastructure plan has been converted from a plan into a bill. So that means that there are about 2,700 lines of legislation, pages of legislation that map out how the spending on infrastructure will proceed. That bill is now finished with this in the Senate and has to go to the House. but it cannot be passed in the House until the progressives are satisfied that they're going to get the second bill, which is the $3.5 billion family plan with budget and with baseline infrastructure spending. So the two are dependent on each other. Whether they pass is dependent. And the big bottom line is, how much will all of it add to the debt and the deficit? And can it be funded, and or how can we reach agreement on how to fund it, the plan going forward? If it adds to the deficit, we're going to really need much more growth to get us out of the debt hole, the debt trap that we're already in, lasting from COVID last year. So altogether, we still need, we don't have enough in those plans. We definitely need an infrastructure bank to cover the rest of it. We don't have enough job creation and restructuring and growth in the economy coming from those plans, and a national infrastructure bank will really help with those things as well. So altogether, we're looking for an infrastructure plan, an infrastructure bank to complement those plans. They will not be enough.
Thank you. Also, on your last slide, you presented the Sanders allocations of all the money in terms of percentages, and you had the annual interest increase within the 10th year, and you showed it as a percentage and also a dollar figure. It's over $1 trillion. Is there any way to stem that tide with what we've got on the table right now?
The best way to stem the tide of interest payments is to grow our way out of our debt. That's what happened the last time we had a national infrastructure bank, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, where we had, because of the Great Depression and because of World War II spending, our debt level was way up here as a percentage of GDP. And then it came way down, and now it's way back up again to where it was before. When it came down, it wasn't that we paid the debt back. It was that our economy grew so fast that we now had new tax receipts coming back into the budget to service the debt, and made the debt actually smaller and in relation to the bigness of things, which is the size of our economy that supports everything. And we can do the same, but we have to achieve higher growth rates. And we cannot achieve higher growth rates with this budget alone. We really need a national infrastructure bank to finance all of our infrastructure, make our economy more efficient, solve our traffic congestion problems, move trucks faster, put people into great paying jobs, by the way, and then those great paying jobs will have respending of their own, and then much more in tax receipts will come back into the public coffers. And that's the big circle that makes debt sustainable over the long run. But we must have growth, and we must have an infrastructure bank that is adequate to the job to finance all of the infrastructure needs.
Thank you again. I always get excited when you go through these things. There's always something new to learn. I have one more question for you. As we're talking about the National Infrastructure Bank and the bills and the politics involved with moving forward, states and cities that are proceeding with certain types of infrastructure projects. For example, the electrification of bus services in cities and states. My question is, as these people proceed, because they're doing this now,
Stan, can you repeat your question because you've frozen out? Oh, we lost Stan. Let's see if we'll come back in.
We'll have to do a retake.
Yeah, Stan, could you repeat the question because you went out?
Oh, I'm sorry. We keep on talking from a political standpoint. We have bills. We know where we want to get to. But as we move forward, we already have people in cities and states that are progressing on infrastructure projects. I know this for a fact. You know it for a fact. Now, I'll use the example of electrification of bus services within states and cities. All right. They're going through their engineering process now. They're trying to figure out how to do it, what is the best methodology, and all those other things. Is there going to be a way that the National Infrastructure Bank, if approved, if created, and starts moving forward, can retroactively pay for some of those engineering fees that are being used to make up these types of projects?
Okay, that's a great question on how we deal with climate change overall, and specifically how we approach it from the viewpoint of electrification of vehicles. Those entities should go ahead and start commencing with their electrification programs, but I can tell you that it will not be enough for two reasons. First of all, we have to provide the electricity to these newly electrified vehicles. So we need more transmission capacity. And we know on the electric grid, we have huge congestion problems, and we have difficulty even with applications for new renewable energy projects to feed electricity to the grid. They're kind of backed up now. So one of the things that the bank will help with is to provide $80 billion for a new grid system that carries high voltage direct current electricity all across the United States, say from a cornfield in Oklahoma to an end user in Atlanta, Georgia, or to a bus depot in Atlanta, Georgia that's electrifying its buses. That's one of the things that we'll really need. In addition, don't forget, electric buses are great because they put lots of people into one vehicle and move very efficiently, transport people very efficiently. But in addition to that, we want to make sure that we solve our traffic congestion problems, and electrifying cars per se will not be enough to do that. We need to have much more rail in our mix. What we know from a climate change point of view is that hydrocarbon emissions and CO2 emissions from transportation contributes 28% of our emissions into the economy, into the atmosphere. So we want really to have more rail in our mix to move passengers and freight more effectively, get as many vehicles off of roads as we can to solve the traffic congestion problems, and have a better transportation mix that's more efficient. And what we know that is since you're a former Amtrak official, is that we can use Amtrak, we can use commuter rail, we can use high-speed rail to move passengers, especially rush hour commuter traffic, much more effectively and efficiently. We have huge traffic congestion problems in the city of Philadelphia, in New York, around the Washington, D.C. area, Atlanta, Georgia, Los Angeles, California. We need much more rail in the mix. And to have more rail in the mix, we need to finance it. And this bank will directly finance those projects.
That was a great answer, but you did not address the question.
Retroactively?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I think the fact that those projects are on the roll now means that don't forget, states and local governments come up, and transit authorities and so forth, come up with plans for doing part of the transportation mix. And those plans are proceeding now. That's why we're seeing these. So that's their contribution to the infrastructure financing plan. Our part will be to pick up what's not being done, and so to have enough money to cover that $5 trillion worth of things that are not being done. We'll be concentrating on that, like Stephen said, on these roads that are not economically contributory or less than contributory, making sure that we have holistic systems in place. It's not enough just to build electric cars. We have all of these utilities underneath the roads that we need to fix as well. We have a big, huge infrastructure backlog. The engineers in their report card did a great job in pointing to the nature of all these things, and we need to have a bank that is able to cover all of it. So electrification of vehicles will be something, maybe not retroactively, but it'll support a whole system that is making our transportation more efficient and less CO2 generating.
One of the things the bank can do is it can, an agency, if they have debt that is at a higher rate than one of the NIB loans. They can apply for a loan, and essentially, there's if the project is already built, then there's far less risk involved, especially also if they have user fees, and so they can apply, and the loan can be paid off and then replaced with much lower cost debt. So that's one of the things the bank can do.
Thank you. We're going to move from Alphecca and we're going to go to Dr. Stephen Hubbard, and I'm going to ask him a few questions regarding some of his points in his presentation, which I thought was an excellent presentation, as it always is. But I want to ask you if you could get a little further in-depth explanation on the figures that you cite as the annual cost of deferring maintenance. And does the figure accelerate as each year goes by?
Right. So this is one of the large unknowns. The way I derived that figure is that I looked at the categories that were not included in the ASCE's estimate, in addition to what was there. And actually, first I talked with the ASCE and asked them if they included deferred maintenance in their estimates, and the answer was no. So in other words, they're just looking at a snapshot of what's needed, not as it increases over time. And actually, I started when their estimate was at 1.9, and at that point, I had somewhere above $50 billion a year. And if you if I followed it along, I pretty much was spot on in my estimate of what the annual increase was, because they're now at 2.6. But what I did is I used several states that had comprehensive statewide infrastructure backlog estimates. And then I scaled them to the United States and included things that were left out. And that's where I came up with the $125 to $200 billion a year. And the answer is yes, it does accelerate. And so there's a slide I didn't show, but there's a rule called de Sitter's Law of 5. He's a famous civil engineer. I think he's passed away. But if you look up on the web, you get someone who's involved with relativity. And this is because his dad was a contemporary of Einstein and did a lot of fundamental work in cosmology. So in any case, if you put in de Sitter and put in concrete, you'll discover after 25 years, he came up with this rule of thumb, which is that basically if you withhold maintenance on reinforced concrete, what happens is little cracks go down to the rebar rusts and then expands. And if you've ever been walking along on a sidewalk, you'll see there's a divot missing, and you'll look down and there's a piece of rebar and you think, why did that happen? And that's because the rust expands and it cracks the concrete. So what happens is when you start withholding maintenance and stop repairing those little cracks, because you're going to use austerity and you're going to save, say, 2% a year, because that's basically what the interest rate is right now on T-bills. And that's going to help reduce the cost of infrastructure. His rule is basically every 5 years, the money that you withheld is multiplied by a factor of 5. So if you withheld $1, just to make it easy, after 5 years, you've actually wasted $5. And after 10 years, it goes 5 times 5. It's now $25 that you've wasted for those few dollars saved. And after 15 years, if you thought you saved $15, it's now 125 times that amount. And you've lost your asset. It's failed. Or the cost of repairing it'll essentially be the cost of a new one. And so this is where, and this is basically multiplied across all of the U.S. infrastructure, whether it's power poles or sewer systems or water systems. Everything grows exponentially, whereas the savings accrues at a very, very small rate. And what happens is that amount is broadcast by the austerity proponents. It's like, look at the money we saved, and you see it in annual reports. And then the enormous loss in terms of increased maintenance is reported elsewhere, and the two are almost never tied together. And so it always looks like austerity is saving you money. In reality, a good rule of thumb is it weighs somewhere between $2 and $4 for every dollar that's reported saved.
Thank you. Let's go back a couple sentences and what you were just talking about, and sort of see if we can get a crystal ball in front of you on your desk. You mentioned the $5 to $1 as we move forward. It's an add-on to a project cost. And if that's what it is, if we defer $4 trillion, because $4.5 trillion, because we're only going to do that 550. What is that cost really going to be, including the deferred maintenance, let's say 5 years from now, when nothing's been done but those projects?
I would, again, use sort of like this standard thing. So if I defer $1 trillion, I would say in 5 years that's going to cost me somewhere between 500 billion and say $2 trillion. And that's a conservative estimate. One of the things that could easily be done is the government could, in California, where I talked about Save California Streets, the U.S. government could easily, for $10 to $20 million, set up a similar system across the entire United States. It's just starting out, if nothing else, with transportation, where agencies would log in, put in what their current deferred maintenance backlog estimates are, and their capital projections for 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16 years out. And after about 3 to 4 months, you'd have enough data to say which view is correct. The U.S. deficit is really small, or the U.S. infrastructure deficit is more on the order of what we're talking about, and it could be done very simply. And then that would end the argument over whether it's small or large. Because right now, when you have two groups that are apart by multi-trillion dollars, it's really hard, as you've seen, to get any kind of coherent policy put together. Because it's like trying to put out a fire. You don't know whether you need to show up with 10 fire companies or a bucket. And that's the problem that we're facing right now. And there's a very simple solution to do that. But I would say that you're looking at over 5 years, somewhere between $500 billion to several $1 trillion. But that's also, in a certain way, the tip of the iceberg, because there are many things that aren't in there. And so, for instance, I talked briefly about cybersecurity. And we've just learned recently from the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Russians, they've schooled us that they can almost shut down parts of our infrastructure at will. And this means with the Internet of Things, that every chip and computer that's connected now to the Internet has to be basically tested, like, Underwriter's Laboratory, but of course to a much higher degree, to make sure that there are no back doors, because it was a foreign chip and that was built into the chip, buried in it somewhere, or it's got either firmware or software that's got a vulnerability in it that can be exploited, because the government has basically had the Russians walk through it for almost a year, their various agencies, including Department of Treasury, because of SolarWinds had a vulnerability in one of their internet switches, and this was then exploited. And so what happens is basically the cyber barrier, if you will, if you want to use a medieval castle as a visual analogy, is that basically we don't know where the holes are, and it's easy for and also the total security of the whole castle is only as good as all of the walls put together, including all of those for all of the little castles around, which you can think of as contractors and things. And so basically, this is an enormous cost that's not anywhere in any of the bills so far, and could lead to the actual economic catastrophe if someone decides to start shutting down large portions of our economy. So rusting pipes is just a small portion of the problem that we're facing right now. We need a comprehensive approach to it, not nickel and dime, which is, I'm afraid to say, what we're doing right now.
So if I took the last part of that sentence, and we've talked about this on several occasions, and I think in one of our previous discussions, you were talking in terms of closer to 7 trillion, $8 trillion is really the infrastructure price tag. Now, does that include this resiliency factor that we just spoke about, as far as?
No,
does not.
It does not include reshoring all of the companies that have been offshored over the last 20 years with the globalization rush, where everything was now being made offshore, and that seemed really great. But as any military man would tell you, when you have basically long supply lines, they're all very vulnerable. And so what we discovered was, it wasn't a war, but basically COVID shut down production overseas. Countries that were making reagents that were critically needed for basically making the shots and other things, or masks, PPE, personal protection, medical protection and all of those things were all kept on shore at the foreign countries. And so we have to reshore several $1 trillion worth of manufacturing, which has all been decimated. So none of that is any of these estimates. And so this is why the $5 trillion bank may even be too small. And what happens is the numbers get so large, people just tune them out and they say,
Right.
well, it's just too large for me to think about. I'm glad we've got this little bipartisan bill. Now I can feel good. And in reality, it's like grabbing onto a little piece of melting ice in the middle of the ocean. And
Right.
doesn't give me a very secure feeling.
That's why I mentioned that in Alphecca's question about how the media portrays certain things and people grab onto it and they really don't understand. So it sounds, when we talk to you and Alphecca, that there is a very serious problem as we move forward if things don't get approved. And there's also a serious problem that we might be short in our estimates for infrastructure. So each of you, I'd like to add. I'm sorry,
let me just let me just add something. So I'm a student of World War II and the Depression. So General Wiedemeyer put together a plan called the Victory Plan. And I think he was a colonel at the time, that basically mapped out everything that was needed to win World War II. And it caused gasps because the number of planes and tanks were just, and sometimes 10 times what people thought was going to be needed. And he had been actually a student at the Wehrmacht and learned German battle tactics and knew exactly what was going to be needed to defeat the Axis, so to speak. And so we need the equivalent of a victory plan. And so you've heard Alphecca and I tossing these huge numbers around. We're not saying absolutely that these numbers are perfectly correct, but what there should be is it should create a sense of alarm in our elected officials, and they should work on putting together a victory plan for the United States, which actually goes out and assesses what is the actual need. Do we really need several $1 trillion to fix the roads in the United States, or maybe is it only 200 or 300 billion and the amount of money is there? The numbers would not be hard to come by. It would only take 6 months to go out and do this kind of assessment, and then we would actually know what it is we need to basically make the United States whole and be secure and compete internationally. And we don't have that information right now, and there's no reason not to do it.
I wholeheartedly
I'd add
agree.
on to that, Stan, too. Don't forget, this infrastructure bank plan has a Buy America only provision in it. And that will make sure that all the inputs into construction are made in America and start a new manufacturing base for our country and something to build upon, where we can do our own computer chips here. We can make our own steel here. We can use cement in construction, the CO2 sequestering cement. We can train people in 21st century technologies. All of this can be done with our bank, but we need to have a bank to make it happen.
I agree with both of you. The situation is such that we're looking at things and we're outside the Beltway, and the people inside the Beltway really don't have a clue. I've got one question I want to pose to both of you, and it's a hypothetical question, but really needs to be brought up from the standpoint that the people need to know exactly what your thoughts would be in this area. And I want you to think about the future and use your individual crystal balls. And from an economic point of view, give some insight as to where the U.S. will go financially and economically if we do nothing to improve the majority of the infrastructure in this country.
So I'm an economist, and I always like economic modeling. Actually, the American Society of Civil Engineers went to my favorite modeler, the University of Maryland, and said, throw all this stuff into the model, all this new spending, and tell me what is the economic impact for America. And it's truly, truly amazing. I mean, we can get our growth rates up to the 5% level with such an infrastructure package. We can make our economy more productive. Trucks will move faster. We'll be able to to increase disposable income for the average American worker because they'll have a great new job, and we'll have much more tax receipts coming in to federal and state and local coffers. This is really good news from an economic point of view. But if we don't do it, our economy goes backwards. So it really is time for us to step up and say, let's have a new bold vision and a new bold plan and really get the job done. And this will not cost the federal budget and any more deficit spending or taxes. It's an easy fix. We've done it 4 times before in our nation's past. It worked great every time, built most of our infrastructure. And this was the mechanism that paid for World War II and the manufacturing base that set us on to be one of the greatest manufacturers in the world. And we need to return to that model today.
Dr. Hubbard?
One of the things I see occurring is a lot of times people look backwards as they think sort of like, what do I need in the future? And the recent past is used as the model. And so what's happening is that everyone who's saying we need to balance the budget and use pay-go to go forward because the deficits are so large is thinking, well, growth as Alphecca is just saying, is up, and 3, 4, 5, 6%, sort of the golden era after World War II, when we basically built everything that we have today, and we reaped the benefits. For every dollar that was spent on the federal highway system, I think approximately $4 to $7 were returned back to the economy. So in other words, if you used $1 worth of tax money, you got $4 to $7 in taxes back over time. And so what's happened instead is income inequality has shifted money to the wealthy, and then they invested offshore as more and more of the money that used to be kept at home to keep the United States first in the world is now going offshore to build factories, and then those goods come on shore. So we've lost the jobs and we've lost the tax revenue. And so now when you look at our failing infrastructure, we used to be first in the world in the 60s. We're now somewhere between 13th and 19th, heading towards 24th, which is where we are in some studies. And so this basically means that if you use pay-go, the country has been put into what's known as a graveyard spiral. So pilots that get lost in clouds bank to the left and accelerate down into a corkscrew until they hit the ground, and they're never able to recover. And essentially, this is what's happened to the economy. It's been put into a graveyard spiral where more and more money goes offshore to build factories. There's no tax revenue. Our infrastructure begins to degrade further. As you see, it's an exponential rate, just like that plane accelerating towards the ground. And so unless we pull back on the stick and apply some gas, things are not going to end well. And so I echo Alphecca's comments, which is we need to basically spend our power our way out of the graveyard spiral we're in. If we pull back on the engines, pull back on the throttle, and grip the stick more tightly, where the ground is going to rush up at us faster and faster, and it's not going to end well.
Well, thank you. I thought this was a great session. You really answered the questions. I'm sorry I couldn't come up with more, but I think for the next time I will. I would suggest those that are watching to think about this and just imagine, okay, as Alphecca said, the last National Infrastructure Bank came to term in 1957. Imagine, and thinking about what they just said about the economics and financial conditions if we don't do anything, imagine if that bank did not end in 1957, where we would be today. We wouldn't have to have these conversations, and everything would be running smoothly insofar as infrastructure is concerned, and would take the political fighting that is involved with all of this out. Members of the coalition, appreciate the time that you've put in watching this small video. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you got a certain amount of clarification as to what we've been talking about, and we will do this again. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.